All right, welcome everybody to the Department of Communication Fall Colloquium Series. I'm so excited to have our speaker today. And for those of you that are watching via live stream, welcome. We will make sure that everybody gets the link to this, including our colleagues at the University of Michigan. So today we have an excellent scholar, QIAOZHU from the University of Michigan School of Information. Where he is a professor. His research covers data mining, information retrieval, machine learning, natural language processing. He's the winner of numerous awards, including an NSF Career Award, has over 100 articles, is extremely well established. We're super excited to have you here. And today you're going to be talking about decoding the New World language, analyzing the popularity, roles, and utility of emojis. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the very warm introduction, Dr. Turner. So it's my great pleasure to be here to drive 60 miles here through the rain. That was fun. Right. So I'm a computer scientist by training. So I mainly build algorithms to deal with very large-scale data sets, right? Building machine learning models. But occasionally I got insights from collaborations from people like you. So I look at social media, right? I deal with rumors, misinformation, right? I learn social identity, how to design experiments to improve people's satisfaction and productivity. And I deal with emojis recently. So every time when I give in an emoji talk, I would actually search, use Google to see whether there are interesting emojis I can find. And then this time I found this tweet. Apparently, Michigan State is looking really good among the emojis. I hope that you could actually beat Wisconsin tomorrow, right? Because we lost. Okay. Right. But in fact, if you look at one reply to that tweet, that makes me even more curious. This gentleman says that, why do emojis always look unhappy? Do you think emojis are always unhappy? They're not, right? People come to this talk because you can actually find emojis everywhere. If you do the Google search, lots of emojis. And emojis have been apparently a big part of our lives. Even one of the emojis, face of joy with tears, has been named as the word of the year in 2015, right? And then if you look at, people's research about emojis, you can see people are building lots of tools, lots of apps to track emojis, to help people use emojis better, and then to even design new emojis. And there are lots of researchers who are actually intrigued by emojis, like me, like myself. So we're writing papers about emojis, right? You can actually see lots of studies. So who in this room have not used emojis in the past week? Please do. Right. So you can see that there's lots of interesting facts about emojis. So when I was convinced by my colleagues like you about the beauty of emojis, the first question I asked was, where did all this start? Right? Or in other words, what is the first emoji in the world? Right? What do you think is the first emoji in the world? Smiley face. Some people would say that, okay, everything started when emojis were included into the Unicode standard. And that's really why that you can actually use emojis on your iPhone, on your laptop, from everywhere, right? So indeed, this happened in 2010, right? But before that, right? People believe that the first set of emojis were created by the Japanese gentleman Shikataka Kurita, sorry, apologize for my pronunciation, right? And you can see that these emojis were created to carry certain meanings, right? Are those the first emojis? I heard that people were mentioning smiley faces, right? If you ask the computer scientists, they may likely to attribute the first emoji or emoticon to Scott Fahlman, who was a professor at CMU, right? In 1982, he actually proposed to purpose particular combinations of symbols, smiley faces, right, and sad faces as particular words. 82. Are those the first emojis in the world?
What's an emoji?
What's the emoji? Good question, right? So you could say that the combination of a few symbols were emoticons. But if you are on the emoticons, then you can see that it could actually date back to 1881, right? So there was the magazine called Puck, and then there was the interesting article about they can actually use symbols to replace the comedians, right? And you can see how similar they are to today's emojis, right? Well, if you're on that, people believe that the first emoji could even date earlier, right? In New York Times, 1862, there was a transcript of the then President Abraham Lincoln's speech, right? And if you look carefully, there's one thing. Where's the emoji? Of course, it's highly disputed whether this was a typo, this was on purpose. But it does look very nicely in the context. Do you think so? Right. So that's probably the first emojis. So do you agree? Would this be the first emoji? Right. Well, if you think about emojis as pictures to carry particular semantics, to carry meanings, then you probably would look at this. And these are the Maya glyphs, right? That dates back to 300 BC, right? So those are pictures. Those are ideograms that people use to carry semantic meanings, to communicate with each other, right? Well, if you are on that path, then people from Eastern Asia knows that there were words and language written on oracle bones, right, on the turtle shells, right, and that dates back to 1500 BC. If you mention that, what about Sumerian cuneiforms, 3000 BC, or Egyptian hieroglyphs, 3000 BC, right? If you actually look at how these little pictures look like, this is actually a larger picture of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. You can see how similar they are to today's emojis, right? So do you agree that these are the first emojis ever in the world? Right? I got more. I couldn't find anything more, so I was satisfied with this collection. And then when I started to, to pack my things into my car, one of my students said that, no, you missed the earliest emoji in the world. I asked what? So they said, this, right? Well, I had no comments, but I agreed to put this slide into my slide deck. So you can see that there are lots of examples of emojis, or rather using pictures, using the ideograms to convey meanings, right? So arguably, emojis are already going beyond the picture symbols. They are actually constructing the symbolic system that people use for daily communications and for cultural transmission, right? So in other words, they are now a language, right, instead of just a set of symbols, right? And this language is similar to the ideographic language. So they're related to pictographic or hieroglyphic or logographic, like modern Chinese or Japanese languages. And they're in contrast to phonographic or alphabetic languages like English and French, right? So you can see that emojis have already become in a language, but are they actually used by all over the world, or are they just used by a few geeks like myself? Right. In fact, there are interesting studies. In 2016, people have analyzed 21 days of tweets. Right. Think about the scale of tweets. 21 days of tweets is a lot, right? And they discovered that emojis are actually used in 1/5 of the tweets. That's a lot, right? And they were actually used by 37% of Twitter users. Again, that's a lot. Right. And in the same year, we also did the big data analytics project, where we analyzed the typing log of the emoji keyboard. I don't know whether you have used this emoji keyboard. You can actually download that from the apps. That was the popular emoji keyboard. So we analyzed 1 month of the log, which contained almost 4 million active users. And these users were not from just one country or two. They were from more than 200 countries. And then we looked at 400 million messages with emojis, right, from the log of this keyboard. And we discovered very interesting facts that we'll show later, right? You can see that emojis are not only a new language, and it is the world language, right? It is used across countries, across cultures, across language barriers, right? They have been used for on different platforms, on your smartphone, on Twitter, right, and even on research papers. In fact, one of my colleagues actually studied how people use emojis as passwords, right? Smartphones, right? So this motivates us to think about why people love emojis, right? As we say that emojis are ideographic instead of alphabetic, right? So if we can actually compare the difference between ideographic language versus phonographic language, you can actually see the differences. Ideograms, pictures, right, they carry lots of meanings, right? So arguably, that the bit of information that you can actually convey in a single emoji is far more than the bit of information you can convey in a single word, right? Because one picture is worth 1,000 words, right? But they're hard to read, right? You can't pronounce the picture, right? They're hard to write, right? Drawing an emoji is hard, right? And they're hard to remember, right? So that makes the ideographic languages very hard for educational purposes, right? Because people can't read, people can't write or memorize, right? So that's why that you can see ideographic languages were not as popular as the alphabetic language in the world passing these 3,000 years. But they do have benefits, right? They're easy to interpret. Even if you don't know the language, you can probably guess, right, from the pictures, right? So for strangers, they are easier for people to understand, right? And they're also easier to be generalized over time, right, and over geographic locations. And we can actually see some interesting examples. And if you look at their counterpart, phonograms, right, alphabets, they don't convey that much information. In other words, they're less expressive, right? But they're so easy to read, right? You can actually get the sound, right, easily from the alphabets. And they're easy to write, easy to memorize. So that makes them a very powerful language for educational purposes, right? Or for communications with restricted region, within culture, within country, right? But comparing to pictures, ideograms, right, they are harder to interpret if you have never read that language before, right? And they're harder to generalize across different locations or different culture and such, right? So if you don't believe me, you can look at the generalization of cuneiforms of Egyptian language and Chinese characters over time, right, over thousands of years. You can see that they do generalize across culture, right, and across time. A fish is always the fish, right? Let me see. Oh, here. A fish is always the fish, right? And an arrow is always the arrow, right? So over many years, over all of the world. So that makes us think, which one do you think is the better language for the new world for the time of the internet, for the time of the web. Ideographic language or phonographic language. In the era of the web, let me give you some hint, right? We were talking about explosion of information, right? Does that call for the language system that's more expressive? That would help us encapsulate more bits of information into the unit, right? And arguably, in this world, written communication is way more common than oral communication, right? How many short messages, how many messages you have sent today through your phone, right? And how many times you actually talk to your friends, right? We use our phone nowadays as the messenger, not as the phone, right, arguably. So Winston called me twice today. I answered neither of them, but I replied to his short message. Right. Another aspect to look at is that writing is never easier nowadays, right? You have very handy tools. You have this typing input methods, right? And they make recommendations to you, right? I said sadly to my wife the other day that I am forgetting how to write certain Chinese characters, right? It's very easy for me to pick what I wanted from the input method. But if you ask me to write one, sometimes I forgot how to write one, right? So it's happening, right? And then we're now talking about global communication, right? So in many times we have to communicate not with people within 30 feet, right? Not with among people in the same room, in the same building. And we're communicating with people who actually live in the other side of the world, who have 12 hours of time difference, right? Who actually speak different languages, right? So under all these very interesting characteristics of communications nowadays in the era of the web, right? Which one do you think would be more promising language, right? Ideographic language or phonographic language? And using the picture stolen from Facebook, you can see that this is how the social network, this is how the communication network look like nowadays across the world, right? So we're calling for the ubiquitous language, the really new world language. And I think emoji is actually on the track to be one of those, right? Now to show some real data, right? This is our analysis from the 400 millions of type logs from that emoji keyboard. You can actually see that this little keyboard is actually used by people all over the world, right? Sometimes very surprising because the density actually were not just in United States, right? But also in India, in Russia, and Australia, and even Northern Africa. So you can see that it's really used by the world, right? And there are more facts about how people use emojis through our big data analytics, right? You can actually see that although people use lots of emojis, thousands of emojis, but their use of emojis is actually quite concentrated, right? In other words, the use of emojis follows the power law distribution, right? So there are about 100 emojis that constitute around 90% of the emoji usage. You can probably guess what they are, right? So distributed like that, right? And then we were not lying that the face of joy with tears is actually the most popular emoji used by the people in 2015. And then if you look at how people use emojis, what are the top emojis used by people in different countries, you can see that they more or less follow some sort of commodity. But there's one country that's so different from others. France, right? That's known as the country of romantic, right? So they use lots of hearts, right? Okay. Another way to think about the commonness and differences of how people in different countries use emojis is through the clustering analysis. So what we did here is first we clustered the emojis based on their semantics into 69 clusters. And then we represent every country based on how frequently people use these emojis in each of these clusters. So that gives us the 69-dimensional vectors of each country. And then we cluster, we do the hierarchical cluster of these countries based on how they use emojis. And that helps us build this dendrogram, right? Or this clusters, this heat map of clusters of the countries, right? And so the country names are too small to view here, right? But if you do some further analysis, you can actually find interesting clusters. For instance, this cluster contains countries from Southern Asia, or from Anglo cultures, from Eastern Europe, Arabic cultures. And if you look at this cluster, which is quite distant from the other cluster, contains Latin America, Germanic Europe, and Saudi Arabia for some reason, right? So you can actually see that through analyzing how people use different clusters, different types of emojis, you can actually get sense of the cultural difference, right? So this is rather intriguing. Again, that we're not theorists. It's easier for us to discover these patterns, but it's harder for us to explain these patterns. So we look at literature. We're trying to find how, what are the possible explanations of this difference. And we did find some evidence from literature that may actually offer possible explanations, right? For instance, so in this 2013 paper, people actually compared, different emoticons used in Oriental culture and in Western culture. And interestingly, people in Oriental countries, they like to use these horizontal emoticons. Do you use those? Did you use those in your? You have to use this, right? Because I use those a lot before the age of emojis. Right, you can see that they actually focus more on the eye shapes, right? Versus in Western culture, right, we focus more on mouth shapes, right? You can actually see that these vertical emoticons were far more popular in, let's say, in English language, right, in Western language. So this could be one possible explanation of the cultural difference. More evidences from literature includes how, when people are making different expressions. So there was the study to track the eye fixations. You can actually see that, in Western Caucasian culture, that the fixations are more evenly distributed in the face, right? But in Oriental culture, East Asian, the fixations, you can see that basically focus on the upper side of the face. So that's the evidence from biology, right? And that may, provide another piece of interesting evidence to our finding. So we're very much intrigued by this. We wanted to see whether there are more finer-grained, expressions, finer-grained representations of cultural difference. And one of our colleagues recommended this Hofstede Culture Index to us. This might be Communication 101 to you, but this is actually something really, advanced for us. Needless to say that this is the 6-dimensional representation of different cultures into things like power distance, individualism, right, masculinity and uncertainty, avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence, right? So what we did here is first, we look at what kind of emojis people use in different countries, right? And then we put those emojis into categories of sentiments, right? So we used natural language processing to actually assign sentiment labels to each emoji. And the sentiments includes both positive and negative or mixed, so this kind of binary classification. And also includes finer granularities like anxiety, anger, and sad, right? So through that, we can actually measure, how sentimental the emojis are used by people in different countries. And then we compute the correlation of those sentiment scores to the culture index. And we can actually see some interesting findings. If you see the star, that means that the Pearson's correlation is statistically significant at a level of 0.05. So one of the dimension is the power distance, right? So roughly, that basically measures, the distance between the most powerful person in the country and the public, right? So you can see that countries that are assigned a high power indices would be Malaysia or Iraq, and countries that has the low power distance would be Czech or Spain, or right, some of the countries that we're familiar with. So it looks like power distance of a country is actually negatively correlated with the sentiments, right, of emojis people use, right? So it's correlated with the negative sentiments, right? And also it's correlated with some certain dimensions of negative sentiments. Does that make sense? Kind of, right? Another interesting dimension is the individualism, right? And you can see that countries with the higher individualism would be Australia or the different country that we reviewed in the previous table, right? France, or countries like Iraq and Jamaican, they have a low individualism. And if you correlate individualism with the sentiments of emojis, you can see that they are actually correlated with positive sentiments, negatively correlated with negative sentiments and other dimensions. Does it make sense? Right. It's hard for us to judge whether it makes sense, but so, our belief is that's kind of right. It's intuitive. And you can see that if you compute the correlation of these other indices to the emoji sentiment, you can see some of the interesting correlations. Some of them are very intuitive. Some of them are kind of intriguing, right? So in this study, we ended here. We discovered these correlations, right? And then in the follow-up work of researchers, I can see that people are trying to give explanations to these correlations. And there were also some challenges about the findings, right? So if you're interested in this piece of work, you can actually take a look at the 2016 paper that analyzed the huge 400 million emoji messages. All right? So this is about the relation of emoji to the world, right? Now let's get back a little bit to the aspect of emoji as the language, right? And arguably, this is something that we're more familiar about, the relation of emojis to languages, because we built natural language processing models for a while, for decades, right? So you can see that emojis are used not alone, right? You never send the emoji. You do send emoji messages with single emojis, but you don't do that often, right? You usually use emojis alongside words, right? So that actually makes us think about how people are actually interpreting emojis. Do they actually use emojis in a way that they were designed for, right? Or do they have their own ways of interpreting the semantics of emojis, right? And also, because emojis are so new, right? Why do people prefer some certain emojis versus others, right? Is that because that just some emojis look prettier than others, or are there other reasons, right? And why certain emojis become popular than other emojis that look just so similar to them, right? If you look at how many smiley faces there are, right, there's lots of choices. Why, like the face of joy with tear becomes the most popular emojis? These are all very intriguing, right? And we also want to find implications that could help us invent new emojis, because every year there are new emojis invented and added into the Unicode standard, right? To answer any of these questions, we need to understand the meanings, the semantics of emojis, right? We want to understand what people use them for. But this is very hard. Understanding the semantics of emojis is very hard. You could argue why they're hard, because when they are adapted to Unicode, right, there's the description about the emojis. Right, and at lunch today, I had some very interesting discussions with students here about how people interpret different emojis, right? But if you look at the Unicode, descriptions of emojis, do you really agree, right? Just some of them. This is our favorite example. It says face with tears of joy, right? When you use this emoji, do you actually mean face with tears of joy? Right. And when you use this is tomato. Of course I know this is tomato, right? And this is the sun behind cloud, okay? Why would I use sun behind the cloud, right? So the problem of this is that these descriptions are not really what the users think they are, because when the users use emojis, they don't read these descriptions, right? And there was the paper supporting our hypothesis, right? So they look at how people interpret emojis on different platforms. Apparently, the same emoji, when you actually use that on Google or on iPhone, and they look differently, right? One particular case is this one. You can see that the same emoji, right? When it's on Google, when it's on Apple, they look completely differently, right? And the sentiment, how people read these emojis also represents this difference, right? And this study was based on surveys, which apparently was not our strength. So we did something that's more fine-grained using big data analytics again. So what we were trying to do is to infer emojis meanings from the data, from actually how people use the emojis alongside words, right? So from the 400 million emoji messages, right, what we did is to use the so-called text representation learning method. So we first look at how the words and emojis are concurring in the same context, right? Say if the emoji is always used together with certain words, then presumably they have similar meanings, right? So from these context windows, we can actually translate all these emoji messages into a concurrence graph, which is a network. Every node is either a word or an emoji. And every edge measures how frequently they appear together in the same context. Okay? So with this graph built, the next thing to do is to actually translate this graph into the high-dimensional embedding space. And basic idea is that it's hard to deal with this discrete topological structure, but it's easier to deal with the representations in a vector space, in a continuous space. And there are handy techniques nowadays called network embedding that you can actually use to do this transformation, right? And with these transformations, now we can actually ask questions about the semantics of emojis in comparison with words, right? And the basic idea is that words and emojis should be close in the same semantic space if they have similar meanings. Right? In other words, you can actually guess the meaning, the true meaning of the emoji based on which words are located in similar locations in this high-dimensional semantic space. Now let's see some examples, right? These four are the old emojis. What do you think they're useful? What do you think the nearest neighbors of words that people use when they're using these emojis? Let's see. Does that make sense? Good morning. That's why people use this emoji, not sun behind the cloud, but they wanted to use this for good morning, right? And this one, right? Does that make sense? Yes. Do you actually see the difference between these two? What about tomato? Right. You. Right. So if you're interested in this, we have released the nice visualization of emojis in the topological space of semantics, like exactly what we described. Every node is an emoji in the visualization, and every edge is actually the semantic similarity between emojis. And then you can actually check the visualization out and see which emojis are actually located together. So this is the 3D visualization. You can take a look. Right. But actually, with this network structure, you can actually do something even more fun, right? For example, you can actually extract the so-called ego net. That is the network of your neighbors, right? So pick an emoji, and you pick the neighbors of this emoji, which may or may not be emojis, it could be words, and you look at how these neighbors connect to each other. That gives you an ego net of this emoji. And apparently, this ego net of the emoji reveals lots of interesting properties of the semantics of emojis, right? For example, the ego net of this emoji actually looks like that, right? This is what? This is red wine, right? And you can see that emojis and words that are neighbors of this emoji include of these and of these, right, words. And they're connected together. You can actually see clusters, right? You can actually see that this emoji is related to, alcoholic drinks and food, right? And fashion, right? And different cocktails. And then they are usually used when people want to say cheers, right? So you can see that the property, the structural property of this ego net actually tell us a lot about emojis. For instance, how dense this graph is, right? How many clusters, how many communities are there in this ego net, right? And so on and so forth, right? For instance, if you look at how close one emoji is next to certain words, right, you can actually measure whether they are actually used complementary or supplementary to popular words, right? You can also measure the ambiguity of meanings of emojis. For instance, if you see clear community structures in its ego net, that usually means that it's ambiguous. People use this emoji either for this meaning or that, right? And you can also look at how many sentimental neighbors they have, and you can either measure the more complex roles of emojis in social network structure, in the social network of emojis and words, right? So, in fact, what we can do is to take them, right, and then correlate them again with the popularity of emojis. And let's see whether we can actually discover some interesting factors that explains why emojis become popular, right? And I will just show you some conclusions again, right? And again, we don't really understand why, right? We're figuring out why. But these are the findings. If you see an emoji that's close to popular neighbors, then it's more likely to be popular, right? If the emoji is less ambiguous, of course, it will be more popular. If the emoji fits a wider context, that means if it just has more words in the neighborhood, then it's more popular, right? And if the emoji have clear word counterpart, then it's likely to be popular, right? That means if it's supplementary to its counterpart, if you can actually use that emoji to replace certain words, then they're likely to become more popular. So, and many of these correlations still holds when you actually put them together into the regression model. Okay. So this is the analysis about semantics of emojis. You can see that using big data analytics, if you're able to construct, topological structure from the big data, and then if you're able to represent the network structure in a high-dimensional space, you can actually measure lots of these factors, right? And then you can actually correlate these measures to the outcome that you're interested in. Of course, that calls for some smart use of state-of-the-art machine learning tools, right? So these are our understanding about how emojis are used by users. The next question, because we are data scientists, we want to know, so what, right? Emojis are popular. How can we make use of emojis for some of the tasks that we care about, right? So we picked a few examples. Some of them are good examples. Some of them are just, just for fun, right? So one thing that we discovered from the distribution of people using emojis is that there's the big divergence. There's the big variance, in terms of age and gender, right? And I apologize that we only have 2 genders here. That's not our fault. That's the app's fault. It only asks for binary genders, right? But you can see that even among the 2 genders, there's the huge difference, right? And in fact, if you look deeper, you can see that there's the very clear gender difference of using emojis, right? Probably not surprising, right? Women use more emojis, and women use more emojis in the same messages, right? And all of them are significant. You can actually also discover emojis that you can label as female emojis versus male emojis, right? By computing the conditional probability of gender given the emoji, or computing the mutual information of each emoji and the gender, right? You can see that these top-ranked emojis are commonly used, more likely to be used by female users than male users. Well, can you guess, are there male emojis too? What would they be? This, right? Embarrassing, but right. And there are more differences about the gender of using language, of being of communication in literature. In psychological literature, for instance, there's beliefs that women are more expressive, right? They are associated with more nonverbal behaviors, right? And there are more facial-related activities, more likely to express love in real life. And then you can also see some connected evidences from emoji usage, as women use more emojis, right? They use more face-related emojis and more sentimental emojis, right? And surprisingly, they use fewer heart-related emojis for some reason. This is we can't explain this, right? So what, right? There's big difference when you look at the data, right? But how big are those differences, right? We wanted to go one step further than just statistical significance, right? And we want to see whether a powerful machine learning algorithm can actually learn from these differences and actually just infer the gender of users purely based on the emojis they use, right? So in fact, looks like we can, right? So for instance, if you pick the messages with emojis, and you just construct a few features purely based on emojis, like the percentage, right? And the percentage of individual emojis, percentage of polarized emojis and messages, right? You can actually build a classifier that put the author, of course, de-identified user, right, into one of the classes, right? So this is the fairly standard machine learning practice, right? You extract a few features, and then you feed that into, let's say, your favorite regression model, and then it gives you the binary output, right? Alternatively, you could also do that with the text, right? Actually, there's lots of work on inferring demographics from tweets, from social media, right? The only difference is that they create those features not based on emojis, but based on the actual text content, right? And then we compared these two approaches, to our surprise that if you just purely use emoji-based features, you can actually do very close to what the text-based classifier could do, right? So that means the difference is actually significant enough, right? That a powerful machine algorithm could actually pick them and then make some predictions, right? And you can see that the performance is actually more accurate for females than males, right? For each of these languages. One of the interesting, so this is the optimized text model's performance, and this is actually a weaker text model performance that's based on pre-trained model. You can see that the performance of emoji-based models is actually on par sometimes with the optimized text model, right? And way better than pre-trained text model. And if you actually look at different languages, you can see that there are some interesting findings. For instance, in Arabic language, it's much easier to infer male from, rather than infer female, which might also be explained by cultural difference. But that's, again, an area that we're not very strong in, right? So you may ask, why do we care about learning these demographic models using emojis, right? In fact, that no matter you like it or not, this is something that the search engine companies or the social media companies are using a lot, like Facebook, Twitter. They're doing this to actually personalize their ads, right? Our argument is that if you let them to build these models using text, it's probably better for them to build them using emojis, right? Because from the text content, you can actually see that there are lots of private information, right? Credit cards, right? License plates, so on and so forth. Plus, most of these content are in English, and that creates another inequality that I will talk about later, right? Versus if you use emojis to build these models, right, you don't actually have much privacy risks, right? Unless people do use emojis as their passwords, and they put the passwords in their tweets, right? So there's much lower privacy risk. And also, you can actually build cross-language models. Because as we see that, people from 200 countries were all using emojis a lot, right? So this could be a potential utility of the emojis, right? So in a very recent work, actually which was published at the World Wide Web Conference this year, we did an essay to address the other, we call that the other inequality on the web. And this inequality is very much related to the artificial intelligence research nowadays. And it is most of the AI models, most of the machine learning models were trained in English, right? This is not surprising because there are more labels in English, right? And there are more researchers who use English language. This is common. But if you look at the proportion of internet users, actually 75% of internet users don't speak English. They use another language, right? So this actually creates the inequality that people actually contribute a lot to the data, actually didn't receive the nice services back from the techniques, right? So how to do that? How to deal with this inequality? Companies like Google have spent lots of dollars to build cross-lingual methods or machine translation tools, right? Typically, what they do is to pick English labeled data, right? Try to learn English models, and then try to transform them, try to transfer them into another language, right? Through, for instance, classifiers, for instance, transfer learning techniques, right? But this approach also has some problems. The problem is that the labels you can actually get in a target language is very few. Right? If you have rich labels, you should actually build a classifier for that language, at the first place. But you're not, right? And it's hard to transfer general knowledge while preserving language-specific patterns, right? Through this approach. So, what they used to do is to build this shaky bridge between English and target languages using machine translation. As we argued that. There's lots of problems with this approach, right? It's able to transfer general sentiment knowledge, but not the language-specific knowledge, right? It does not capture language-specific sentiment knowledge, and the performance varies over different languages, depending on how much training data you have. So we actually need a better bridge. And because that conference was in San Francisco, we said that we need a Golden State bridge, right? And we actually needed a bridge through emojis, right? So we proposed a kind of hard machine learning model, right? Kind of hardcore machine learning model called ELSA with the nice name, right? That's leveraging the dual rules of emoji. We use emojis both as the surrogate training labels for sentiments and also as the bridge across languages. And through that, we actually achieve state-of-the-art performance in cross-lingual sentiment classification. And the good thing about that is that now you need no human-labeled examples in the target language. All you need are emoji tweets, right? Tweets with emoji in that language, which is widely available, right? Because the talk is not given in the computer science department, I will skip the details of that model. Right, so basically, what we did is to build a representation model that's again based on how emojis were used alongside with text. But this time it's harder, right? because you first embed the words and emojis into your embeddings, and you construct a prediction problem that you use the text in the tweet to predict what kind of emojis are used in the text. And this is actually constructed based on a deep neural network model, right? And I will skip these two model structures, right? But basically, what that leverages are the two representations of the text models, one in English, one in the target language, and then you actually, build the two neural network models from both sides, and then you connect them together using emojis, right? And this is actually the best paper award that we won from the World Wide Web conference this year. So these are the work that we have done recently about emojis, right? But we're more interested in ask what's next, right? Because we have our limits of methodology that we use. We're used to deal with large-scale data, build machine learning algorithms, but it's harder for us to actually come up with explanations, theory, and also the new insights of how to move forward. We can name a few. For instance, that we want to answer what emojis are more effective than others and why. And that calls for the collaboration from different fields, right? One may be interested in how to understand evolution of emojis, how different versions of emojis replace each other, right? And one may be interested in how to utilize emojis to improve data mining tasks, and how to actually view emojis as the digital creation, and how to understand the adoption of information. That's the key topic that sociologists like to answer. And also, how to connect emojis with social identities. You actually see lots of these examples to see people in different identity groups use specific emojis, right? And finally, how to make use of emojis to promote communications, actually to deal with better tasks. And this definitely calls for expertise from communication, from behavioral economics, from psychology, from HCI, right? Just a spoiler that recently we found that if you use emojis in your GitHub report, your issue got fixed earlier. Oh. Right. So GitHub community is actually a community for developers to deposit their code, ask questions, call for help. If you include an emoji into your post, right, you got more replies. Your issue got fixed early. Right. So there are lots of them. Right. And again, this really calls for the collaboration from a large community, not just from computer scientists, data scientists, also from communication, from economics, from psychology, and from people who understand both language and human. Right? So with that said, this is the summary of what we have talked about today. Right? Don't know how much you can remember, but please remember that emoji is the new ideographic language in the area of world. There are lots of researches we can do. Right? Finally, I want to thank my collaborators, right? And people who either give us money or give us data, right? And if you have questions, you can find me through this email. Thank you very much.
Do you have time to take a few questions?
Of course,
I think we can
please.
for a little bit.
Yep.
Any questions?
Or comments?
Yes.
I have a question. In the first paper you present, I was wondering how did you derive the emotion dimensions of the emojis?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. The question is, how did we derive the emotion dimensions of emojis, right? So we use the natural language processing tool called LIWC, L-I-W-C. So that's the package that you can freely download. That analyzes any piece of natural language text and put that into different dimensions. So what we did there is to look at the Unicode descriptions of the emojis, which unfortunately are the examples you don't like, like the face of a tear of joy, right? And put that description into the natural language processing tool, and that assigns the different dimensions of sentiments to that emoji.
From the descriptions?
From the description of emojis.
Can you go back to that slide?
Okay, let me see.
Cross-tab the emotional dimensions and the different culture dimensions.
This one, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Are those the dimensions you derived, I would suspect there are more dimensions.
They are, yes, they are. So there's a limit of, of the dimensions that people have trained the classifiers for, right? And also, the amount of data that you can actually derive them, right? So what we did is to pick up a field that the machine learning tool is more confident about, right? And it's also more useful, right? But in real research, you can actually see people, doing like classification of sentiments, classification of emotions, and actually they're able to classify the sentiments of text and emojis into tens of dimensions, right? But those tools, you most likely you have to train the models by yourself, right? So which is again a question of how much you can actually leverage existing tools and how much work you have to do to customize that. Yes.
I just want to say thank you. This was like super interesting. I love it. I showed the emoji tracker to my
Thank you.
large undergrad comm class, and they love it. They call the joy with tears face, they call it crying laughing face. So that's how they call it, crying laughing face. That's it. And we love watching it because it's always the #1 most popular one that's always blinking green when I put it up on the screen, and they're like, oh, look at that. They get so excited about it.
Thanks.
And I also, now that Ron's gone, I can say this. I love that it's so like McLuhan-esque, because it really is like flipping back from sort of text-based, like the text was so dominant, and now we're going back to the image, and it's exactly what he would predict happening with like the new medium. And I just was super excited. I really honestly. Oh wait, no, I did have a question. I was like, I'm just super excited to fangirling, but I do have a question. So
Sure.
when you're talking about the social identities, one thing that my students were really excited about was they use emojis like slang. So like small groups of
Yes,
them will
yes.
say that like
Yes.
now the dragon means
Yes.
something like, oh, you're super cool.
Yes,
And
yes.
then like these 7 people will dragon each other.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's like it's almost like social identity, but it's more like
Yes.
using a commonly accepted
Right.
term in a new way.
Right. There are at least 2 perspectives to think about that phenomenon. One is that it's really that people are using emojis differently when they're expressing different identities. Another is actually connect that to language. So they're first assigning new meanings to words, which happen a lot in history of natural language, right? Another thing is that people now, I don't know whether you have discovered this or not, but people now have been using emojis in pairs or in sequences.
Yes.
So you use a combination of emojis to express something that's, that has the fixed semantics. And we're actually making an analogy of that to the emergence of grammar.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know whether that's the right analogy or not, but you can actually see that people are actually adding in grammar into the use of emojis.
Yeah, there was a sequence in one of the
Right.
TV shows I was watching where somebody was trying to communicate something and did it and said, I don't understand what this means, and listed off a string of emoji. And then the guy said back, oh, I thought you would understand it meant blah, blah, blah. This is a huge, complicated thing.
Exactly.
So exactly like what you're talking about.
Right, and so when first done the first paper, and that was picked by the media, then we received a gift from the company who's apparently doing emoji products. And one of the my favorite gift was the book written in emojis. So there's no single word. Everything's emoji, right? And it's readable. It's very hard for me to understand what they mean, but apparently that becomes the favorite book of my kids, right? So I can see that they're actually reading it, right? So it's coming, right? You can see that people are really creating a language per se from emojis. Yes.
I thought your point was interesting. You made from the beginning about different levels of expressivity between emojis versus text, and it
Yes.
seems like a lot of it depends on what you're trying to express, and sometimes emojis are very well suited, other times not so much. Like that book, I'm sure is pretty limited in terms of
Right.
the different kinds of ideas it could express in that all emoji book. And
Right.
thinking about when emojis are ambiguous, it seems like, when you're limited in your channel, like to text only, for example, sometimes your emotions are more ambiguous. Like if you're being sarcastic, for
Right.
example, that can get completely missed by your audience. So I was wondering, do you see emojis used a lot in terms of clarifying the intention
Yes.
of the text?
Yes. So we actually had this conversation at lunch today, right? So you can see people use different emojis. Like sometimes when they actually express something that sounds negative, they put a smiley face there, right? That's indicating that this is sarcastic.
So you could say like, I hate you, but like wink, like, okay, I don't actually hate you.
Yes, right. And there are things like in Chinese social media, people like to use a certain emoji that's actually a face of a duck. I think some Chinese students may actually know that, right? It's also the sign of sarcasm, right? It's similar to people use /s on Reddit, right? So you can actually see that people use emojis to adjust the tones, right? To make their sentiments more clear, right? And sometimes to strengthen their expressions in text. And one of the very interesting facts about the new language versus the other ideographic languages in history is that when those languages were invented, there were no other language, right? That was just those language. And now people are using natural language, and now there's emoji, right? So I don't think that emojis could actually replace human language. It's more interesting to see how that actually be, emerged into human language, or how the two languages interplay with each other. Yes?
I'm curious, so when you're looking at deriving like the meaning of emojis, like the slang meaning of emojis, if you're, I don't know how you do this, but comparing to the definition, like user-generated definitions for emojis that are, say, like on
Right.
Urban Dictionary.
Right.
Like if you search, like people who don't know what the peach emoji is can just go on Urban Dictionary and it'll say. Are you able to compare your data to that? Just kind of look at what the user-generated, because they upvote different meanings.
That's
so
a
you
good
can see
question.
that like that evolves over time too.
We did not. We did not. We didn't even know that whether emojis were included in those urban dictionaries. We should look at that, right? If you know that people are also putting the emojis into the urban dictionaries like that, let us know.
I think they only do it for like the most popular emojis, or the ones that, like a peach becoming synonymous with butts is kind of wild. So that's weird and goes online. But it'd be interesting to look into user-generated.
Oh, definitely.
Stuff. Yeah.
Definitely. We'd love to look at that. Thanks. Yes?
I have a question. Like, you talk like you try to use emoji as maybe another dimension or another system of labels to detect the sentiment of sentences and try to use such tools as a bridge to help the translation of different languages. But I'm just wondering, like when we are using emojis, we are actually like using such emojis in different kinds of context with different interaction with different people. Like if I'm talking, like if I'm texting with my mom, I'm like, maybe you use your system of emoji. But if I'm
Use your system.
texting with my colleagues or with my classmates, I might use another system of emojis. And maybe we will use the same emojis, but under different kind of context with different kinds of understanding. The same emojis can hold different meanings.
Yes.
Like if there's an emoji like smiling, but maybe in Chinese, a younger generation, such emoji would be thought as a sign of sarcasm. But for the older generation, they would feel that the emoji of smiling is a way to show kindness.
Yes.
So under different, like maybe social norms, maybe different context, we would have different understandings about emoji. But about your analysis, it's based on big data. It's based on how people interact in different kinds of social contexts. So how can you like to distinct such differences in different social contexts, in different environments, to describe different kinds of meanings underlined in this kind of emojis?
So first of all, there's a large body of research on understanding personal usage, personal preferences, personal interpretations of emojis, right? And arguably, that's very related to how people use natural language, right? Because when people use words, they also use them in personal, in social, in whatever context. They mean different things, right? So there's the big body of research in natural language processing that, if you're interested, you can take a look at. And how you use emojis for data science tasks really depends on the task, right? So for instance, if your task is to, let's say, train the machine learning model, right, that actually take an outsample piece of text to predict X, Y, Z, right? Then making use of the commonly shared signals from the big data would be more important, because you don't know actually whether the outsample text will be written by certain users or in what context. But if your task, for instance, is to provide personalized recommendations, for instance, then you really need to figure out the personal disambiguation of the emoji semantics. So I think that's the task-dependent question. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think thanks all for coming, and thanks Dr. Pei for this very interesting and insightful talk. Okay, thank you.